When 38-year-old widow Elizabeth Cooper, a former NSA cryptanalyst, reluctantly accepted the inheritance of her late husband's eccentric uncle's isolated cabin in the Sierra Nevada, a property she desperately planned to sell to prevent foreclosure on her family home. She never imagined that repairing a damaged floorboard would reveal a hand-drawn map created by Francis Gary Powers himself, the U-2 pilot shot down over Soviet airspace in 1960. This map leads to a $20 million gold cache missing for over 65 years from the CIA's Operation Gold, hidden in the treacherous canyons of the American West. Before we dive into this extraordinary journey, tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. And if this story captivates you, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have an even more remarkable tale of lost treasure waiting for you. The certified letter from Blackwood and Associates Legal Services had been sitting unopened on Elizabeth Cooper's cramped kitchen counter for nearly a week, buried beneath a mountain of overdue bills, medical statements, and foreclosure warnings that had become the unwelcome wallpaper of her daily existence. At 38, Elizabeth had thought she and Douglas had finally achieved the American dream in their modest three-bedroom home in Arlington, Virginia. Douglas's engineering firm had been thriving. Their twin daughters, Hannah and Grace, were excelling in middle school, and they had even started planning a family vacation to Europe that would never happen. The medical bills from Douglas's brief but intensive hospital stay had quickly consumed their modest savings, and without his income, Elizabeth's part-time job as a community college instructor barely covered groceries, let alone the mortgage payments that seemed to grow more impossible each month. "Mom, you really should open that," 13-year-old Hannah said over breakfast, gesturing toward the envelope while methodically eating store-brand cereal that had replaced the name-brand options they could no longer afford. Her twin sister Grace nodded in agreement, both girls having developed the worried expressions of children forced to understand adult financial stress far too early. "It's probably just something about Uncle Warren," Elizabeth replied, taking a sip of the weak coffee she'd been stretching by using fewer grounds each morning. "You know how he was Dad's uncle, the one who lived like a hermit up in the mountains?" Warren Cooper had been Douglas's paternal uncle, a mysterious figure who had lived alone in a remote cabin somewhere in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Family legend suggested he had been a test pilot or maybe a military contractor, but details about his life remained frustratingly vague. The few times Douglas had mentioned him, it was with a mixture of curiosity and mild embarrassment about having such an eccentric relative. "But what if it's something important?" Grace pressed, displaying the same persistent nature that had made her an excellent student before their world fell apart. "What if he left you something that could help us?" Elizabeth's laugh held no humor as she glanced around their kitchen, noting the stack of unpaid bills held down by a coffee mug and the refrigerator covered with final notices. The idea that Warren Cooper, a man who lived without electricity or running water in a cabin somewhere in the wilderness, could have left anything of value seemed absurd. With a resigned sigh, Elizabeth tore open the envelope. Her eyes widened as she scanned the formal language typed on expensive letterhead. "Uncle Warren died 2 months ago," Elizabeth said slowly. "According to this, he left his property to Douglas, and since Dad's gone, it transfers to me. A cabin and 40 acres in the Sierra Nevada near a place called Bishop." The girls' faces immediately brightened with possibilities that Elizabeth was afraid to encourage. She continued reading the legal document, her initial spark of hope quickly dimming as the details became clear. The property was described as extremely remote, accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicle and hiking trail, with no utilities, no road maintenance, and significant structural issues requiring immediate attention. "How much is it worth?" Hannah asked with the practical directness she'd inherited from her father. "The county assessor values the land at about $50,000, but the cabin is apparently in such poor condition that it might not be habitable. There are also back taxes owed nearly $800,000 and multiple code violations filed by the Forest Service." The mathematics were cruel but simple. Even if she could sell the property immediately, the proceeds after taxes, legal fees, and outstanding obligations would barely cover 3 months of their current expenses. Elizabeth called the number listed on the letterhead, hoping to expedite whatever legal requirements would allow her to sell the property quickly. The conversation with Mr. Jonathan Blackwood introduced complications she hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Cooper, California inheritance law requires heirs to conduct a personal inspection of remote properties before any sale can be completed, particularly when environmental or safety issues are involved. Elizabeth closed her eyes in frustration. Is there absolutely no way around this requirement? I'm dealing with some financial challenges right now, and travel really isn't feasible. Unfortunately, your uncle-in-laws will contain specific provisions about the property inspection, and California law is quite clear about environmental assessments for Forest Service adjacent lands. Without the required personal inspection, the probate court cannot release clear title for any sale or transfer. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Elizabeth spread out her limited options like a general, planning a military campaign with insufficient resources. The plan crystallized with the desperate clarity that comes from having no alternatives. She would drive to Bishop over the weekend, meet with the Forest Service representative, document whatever needed to be documented, and complete the legal requirements to sell Uncle Warren's property. Friday morning arrived crisp and clear. Elizabeth had packed their small cooler with sandwiches and snacks and loaded the car with emergency supplies. The twin girls were excited despite the circumstances, treating the unexpected journey as an adventure rather than a desperate measure. It's like we're explorers, Grace said as they headed west toward the mountains. Maybe Uncle Warren left us something amazing like buried treasure or something. Mom, what do you remember Dad saying about him? Why did he live alone up there for so long? Hannah asked. Your father said Warren had been some kind of military pilot, maybe test flights for the Air Force back in the 1950s and 60s. He came back from somewhere overseas around 1963 and just never rejoined society. Dad thought maybe he'd had some kind of trauma from his service and preferred solitude. The drive took them through increasingly spectacular but intimidating terrain as they climbed from the plains into the Sierra Nevada. The landscape transformed from agricultural valleys to dense forests of pine with snow-capped peaks rising dramatically on all sides. They stopped for lunch in Bishop, a picturesque mountain town surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that attracted tourists and outdoor enthusiasts from around the world. Elizabeth found herself genuinely appreciating the majesty of the landscape, even as she worried about their car's ability to handle the rough terrain ahead. The Forest Service office was staffed by a friendly ranger named Jessica Reynolds, who had clearly been expecting Elizabeth's visit and seemed sympathetic to her situation. Mrs. Cooper, I've reviewed the file on your uncle's property. It's definitely remote, about an hour's drive from here on some pretty rough roads, then a short hike to reach the actual cabin. The main concerns are basic structural safety and ensuring no environmental contamination before any sale or development. Ranger Reynolds spread out a detailed topographical map pointing to a small square marking Warren's property in a valley surrounded by national forest land. Your uncle was actually well regarded by our department. He lived very lightly on the land, never caused any problems, and actually helped us with fire prevention and wildlife monitoring over the years. Looking at the map, Elizabeth felt a mixture of apprehension and curiosity about what they would find in the remote valley where Uncle Warren had spent decades in solitude. The property seemed impossibly isolated, surrounded by wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction. The forest road that led to Warren Cooper's property quickly deteriorated from rough pavement to gravel, then to little more than two tire tracks, separated by a ridge of weeds and small rocks that scraped ominously against the Toyota's undercarriage. Elizabeth gripped the steering wheel tightly as they climbed steadily through dense stands of pine, the trees closing in on both sides. Mom, are you sure we're going the right way? Hannah asked after they had been driving for nearly an hour without seeing any signs of civilization. Elizabeth consulted the handwritten directions Mr. Blackwood had provided. According to the lawyer's notes, we should reach a creek crossing, soon then look for a wooden post with Cooper carved into it. The creek crossing turned out to be more challenging than expected. The narrow wooden bridge looked sturdy enough, but the approach required navigating several deep ruts that made the Toyota's suspension groan in protest. Beyond the bridge, the road improved slightly, winding through a meadow dotted with wildflowers. The wooden post bearing Cooper, in crude carved letters, appeared exactly where Mr. Blackwood had indicated, marking a barely visible track that branched off from what passed for the main road. There, Grace pointed through the windshield as they crested a small rise. Through the trees, Elizabeth could see a small log structure in a clearing beside what appeared to be a natural spring. The cabin looked ancient and weathered, with a stone chimney that had partially collapsed and a metal roof that had turned green with age and moss. Beside it stood a smaller outbuilding that might have been a workshop, and beyond that the rusted remains of what had once been a jeep. They parked beside the cabin, and Elizabeth immediately understood why the Forest Service had concerns about the property's condition. The front porch sagged dramatically on one side, several windows were broken or boarded over, and the entire structure seemed to lean slightly as if the foundation had shifted over the decades. "It's like a ghost town," Hannah whispered as they climbed out of the car, the mountain air crisp and thin at this elevation. The cabin's front door was secured with a heavy padlock that looked much newer than the surrounding structure. Mr. Blackwood had provided a key along with his directions, explaining that the Forest Service had secured the property after Warren's death. The lock opened smoothly, but the door itself required significant effort to push open, scraping against warped floorboards. The interior was dimmer than expected, with only a few narrow windows, allowing dusty beams of sunlight to illuminate a space that seemed frozen in time. The main room contained basic furniture that appeared to have been handmade decades earlier: a wooden table and chairs, a stone fireplace with cooking implements hanging beside it, and shelves lined with books, canned goods, and various tools and supplies. "This is so weird," Hannah said, stepping carefully across the uneven floor. "It's like he was living in a time capsule. Look, he doesn't even have electricity." Elizabeth examined the books on the shelves, finding an eclectic collection that surprised her. Alongside practical volumes about wilderness survival were works of history, physics, engineering, and what appeared to be military and aviation manuals from the 1950s and 60s. Many of the books were technical in nature, with titles like Principles of Radio Navigation and High-Altitude Flight Operations. "Mom, check this out," Grace called from what appeared to be a bedroom area partitioned off by a heavy curtain. "There's all this old stuff in here." The bedroom contained a simple cot with military-style blankets, a wooden chest, and walls covered with maps, photographs, and what looked like technical diagrams that created a complex collage spanning several decades. Many of the diagrams were yellowed with age and covered topics related to aircraft design, radio systems, and what appeared to be aerial photography equipment. The photographs ranged from black and white images of military aircraft to more recent color prints of the surrounding landscape marked with handwritten notes. But it was the maps that drew her attention most strongly. Unlike modern topographical surveys, these appeared to be hand-drawn, showing not just the local terrain, but also areas that looked European with German place names and coordinates. Many were marked with symbols and notations that seemed to indicate locations of particular significance. "These are incredible," she murmured, studying a particularly detailed map that showed what appeared to be the city of Berlin, divided into sectors with precise boundary lines and notations about checkpoints and observation posts. "It looks like he spent years documenting Cold War Berlin. But why?" Hannah joined her mother in examining the wall display. "Look at these dates, Mom. Some of these maps are from like the 1950s, but others are much more recent. And see how he's connected different locations with red string, like in detective movies." Following Hannah's observation, Elizabeth realized that Warren had created something approaching a research project on his cabin walls, connecting geographical features, military installations, and what appeared to be flight paths in patterns that suggested he was pursuing some kind of long-term investigation or interest. "Girls, we should focus on documenting the structural issues for the Forest Service report," Elizabeth said, though she found herself increasingly curious about the materials Warren had assembled. "We need to check the foundation roof condition and any environmental concerns before it gets dark." As they worked their way through the cabin, documenting problems with Elizabeth's phone camera, Hannah made an observation that stopped their progress entirely. "Mom, this floor doesn't feel right in this corner. It's like hollow or something." Elizabeth knelt beside her, water pressing against the floorboards in the area Hannah had indicated. Indeed, the sound was different, more resonant, as if there was empty space beneath this section of the floor. Using a multi-tool from the car's emergency kit, Elizabeth managed to pry up several floorboards, revealing a shallow space that had been deliberately created beneath the cabin's floor. The area was lined with metal sheeting and contained several wrapped packages that had been carefully protected from moisture and pests. "What is all this stuff?" Grace wondered, as Elizabeth carefully lifted out the first package. The wrapping proved to be oilcloth tied with nylon cord. Inside the first package, Elizabeth found more maps, but these were different from the wall display. These were older, drawn on different paper with different techniques and marked with symbols and notations that were clearly from an earlier era. The second package contained what appeared to be a leather journal or logbook, its pages filled with handwritten entries in faded ink. The handwriting was different from the modern materials on the walls, more formal and elaborate. "Mom, look at this," Hannah said, pointing to a date visible on one of the journal pages. 1960. This stuff is like over 60 years old. Elizabeth carefully turned the brittle pages, trying to decipher the faded handwriting while protecting the fragile paper. The entries appeared to be some kind of daily record documenting travel operational details and geographical observations. Many entries mentioned specific locations by name, though the place names were often unfamiliar or seemed to be in code. As the afternoon light faded, Elizabeth realized they had discovered something far more significant than a simple inheritance. The hidden materials suggested that Warren's cabin had been more than just a hermit's retreat. It had been the repository for historical documents and maps that might have considerable value to researchers, collectors, or historians interested in Cold War military operations. "We need to be very careful with all this," she told her daughters as they rewrapped the materials and placed them back in their hiding place. "These could be historically important, and we don't want to damage them by handling them too much." What if Uncle Warren hadn't been simply an eccentric hermit, but someone who had inherited or discovered historical materials of genuine significance? What if the property's value wasn't in the land or cabin, but in the documents and maps he had spent decades preserving? As darkness fell over the remote valley with stars becoming visible through the crystal-clear mountain air, Elizabeth gathered her daughters close and began planning their next steps. The inherited cabin that had seemed like another burden might actually represent the opportunity they had desperately needed, though, in a form she never could have anticipated. The nearest motel turned out to be a weathered establishment called the Pine View Inn, located 30 minutes back down the treacherous forest roads. The motel room was basic but clean, with 2 double beds and a small table where Elizabeth spread out the photographs she had taken of the hidden materials. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting, the images revealed details that had been difficult to see in the cabin's dim interior. The old maps showed remarkable artistic skill and geographical precision, while the journal entries appeared to document extensive travel and operational activities throughout Europe during the Cold War period. One map in particular caught Elizabeth's attention, a detailed rendering of what appeared to be an underground tunnel system beneath the streets of Berlin, with precise measurements and notations about depth, structural supports, and what might be electronic equipment. "Mom, I've been thinking about those maps," Hannah said as they shared a dinner of vending machine snacks and convenience store sandwiches. "Some of those places looked familiar from our history unit at school. Didn't we study about the Berlin Wall and stuff?" Grace nodded enthusiastically. "And remember that documentary we watched about spies during the Cold War? There was something about a tunnel that the Americans dug to tap into Soviet communication lines in East Berlin." Elizabeth examined the photographs more carefully, trying to correlate the hand-drawn features with her limited knowledge of Cold War history. The maps showed extraordinary detail in areas she recognized from documentary footage and history books, but they also depicted locations and installations that didn't appear in any public historical accounts she had seen. The next morning brought crisp mountain air and crystal-clear blue skies. Elizabeth had arranged to meet Forest Service Ranger Reynolds at the property by Tennyson Horrors to complete the required environmental and structural assessment, but she found herself eager to return to the cabin for reasons that had nothing to do with legal requirements. Ranger Reynolds was already waiting when they arrived. She greeted them warmly and immediately began the systematic inspection process, documenting structural issues with a professional thoroughness. "The main concerns are fairly typical for remote properties this age," Reynolds explained, as she photographed foundation problems and roof damage. "The good news is that your uncle maintained the property well within environmental guidelines. No contamination issues, no illegal dumping, minimal impact on the surrounding ecosystem." As the ranger worked, Elizabeth found herself drawn back to the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. In better light and with proper tools, she could see that the space had been deliberately constructed, lined with metal sheeting, and sealed with what appeared to be some kind of waterproof compound to prevent moisture damage. This wasn't a casual hiding place, but a carefully engineered archive designed to preserve valuable materials over decades. "Mrs. Cooper," Ranger Reynolds called from outside, "could you come take a look at something?" Elizabeth found the ranger examining the smaller outbuilding behind the cabin, which had appeared to be a simple storage shed from a distance. Up close, however, it showed evidence of more sophisticated construction and recent maintenance that contrasted sharply with the cabin's deteriorated condition. This structure is in much better shape than the main building, Reynolds observed, testing the solid wooden door and examining the metal roof that showed no signs of leakage. It looks like Mr. Cooper prioritized maintaining this building over his living space. Inside, they discovered what could only be described as a workshop and research facility that seemed incongruous with the primitive living conditions of the main cabin. The building contained a workbench with tools for document preservation, photographic equipment that appeared to be several decades old but well-maintained, and filing cabinets that were locked with smaller keys Elizabeth didn't possess. Most significantly, the walls were covered with large-scale maps that appeared to be professionally printed. Military surveys marked with the same types of symbols and notations they had seen in the cabin. "This is remarkable," Reynolds said, examining the setup with professional interest. Mr. Cooper appears to have been conducting some kind of serious historical or intelligence research. These military survey maps are extremely detailed and would have cost considerable money to obtain. Hannah pointed to a corner where several framed photographs showed groups of men in military uniforms standing beside aircraft or in front of buildings with official-looking signage. Mom looked at the patches on these uniforms. "This stuff is really official-looking." Elizabeth studied the photographs more carefully, noting that many showed the same distinctive buildings and installations depicted in the hand-drawn maps. One photograph in particular caught her attention. It showed a group of men in civilian clothes but with military bearing posed before a nondescript building with a sign in German. Written in faded ink below the photograph were the words "Op Gold Team Berlin, 1955, and a list of names, one of which had been circled in red W. Cooper signals. "Hannah Grace, come look at this," Elizabeth called, studying the photograph intently. Operation Gold was a real CIA operation during the Cold War. There was a joint American-British intelligence mission to tap into Soviet communication lines by building a tunnel under East Berlin. Reynolds joined them in examining the photograph, her expression growing increasingly interested. "Mrs. Cooper, your uncle appears to have been documenting some significant Cold War history." Operation Gold was indeed a major intelligence operation in the mid-1950s. If these are authentic photographs from that period, they could be quite valuable to historians and military researchers. The implications began to crystallize in Elizabeth's mind. What if Warren hadn't simply been an eccentric hermit, but someone who had dedicated his life to researching and documenting Cold War intelligence operations? "There's something else you should see," Reynolds said, pointing to a large map mounted on the far wall. Unlike the others, this one appeared to be modern, printed on contemporary paper, but marked with the same symbolic notations found throughout Warren's collection. This showed military installations throughout the southwestern United States. It marked with what appeared to be specific locations of historical interest. "Mom," Grace said quietly, pointing to a small notation in the map's corner that they had almost missed, "Look at this date." The date notation indicated that Warren had been actively maintaining and updating his research until very recently, possibly until shortly before his death. This wasn't a historical hobby he had pursued decades earlier, but an ongoing investigation that had occupied him throughout his years of solitude in the mountain cabin. As Reynolds completed her official inspection and began preparing the necessary paperwork, Elizabeth found herself facing a decision she hadn't anticipated when they began this journey. The legal requirements for selling the property could be satisfied with Reynolds' documentation clearing the way for whatever minimal proceeds might be available from a quick sale. But the historical materials they had discovered might represent something far more valuable than the land itself. "Ranger Reynolds," Elizabeth said carefully, "if someone wanted to have historical documents and photographs properly evaluated, what would be the best way to proceed?" Reynolds considered the question thoughtfully. "For materials of this potential significance, I'd recommend contacting the history department at Stanford University. They have experts in Cold War history and would know how to properly assess and preserve documents from this period. There is also the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C., though that might be more complex to arrange. There's also the question of legal ownership," Reynolds continued. "As the inheritor of the property, you would own anything your uncle left here, but if any of these materials were borrowed from government archives or other collections, that could complicate matters." "What would you recommend as the next step?" Elizabeth asked, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of what they had discovered. Complete the legal requirements for the property first. Reynolds advised practically. That gives you clear ownership and prevents any complications while you're researching the historical materials. Then contact academic experts who can help you understand what you found and advise you on the best way to proceed. As they prepared to leave the property, Elizabeth took one final walk through the cabin and workshop, trying to absorb the full scope of what Warren had accomplished during his decades of isolation. The man she had barely known had clearly been pursuing something far more significant than simple hermit living. He had created a research facility dedicated to documenting Cold War intelligence operations, preserving materials that might otherwise have been lost, and possibly pursuing leads that professional historians had never explored. The drive back to Bishop gave her time to process the morning's discoveries and begin planning their next steps. The immediate financial pressures that had driven this trip remained unchanged. They still needed income to prevent foreclosure, still faced mounting bills and limited resources. But the possibility that Warren's historical collection might provide a different kind of solution was becoming increasingly compelling. "Mom, what are you thinking?" Hannah asked as they descended from the mountains toward the valley floor. "I'm thinking that maybe we need to learn more about what Uncle Warren was really doing up there," Elizabeth replied, "before we make any decisions about selling the property. We should find out if he left us something more valuable than land." The decision crystallized as they reached the main highway. Instead of returning immediately to Virginia, in their desperate financial situation, they would extend their stay long enough to have the historical materials properly evaluated. The modest cost of additional motel nights and meals would strain their resources further, but the potential rewards justified the risk if Warren's collection proved as significant as it appeared. Stanford University's sprawling campus, spread across the rolling hills of Palo Alto, its Spanish colonial revival architecture, creating an atmosphere of academic permanence and historical continuity. Elizabeth had called ahead and managed to schedule a late afternoon appointment with Dr. Richard Harmon, the head of the Cold War Studies Department. Your Harmon turned out to be a man in his early 60s with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent considerable time in field research. His office walls were covered with maps, photographs, and artifacts that immediately reminded Elizabeth of Warren's workshop, though arranged with academic organization rather than the hermit's intuitive system. "Mrs. Cooper, thank you for coming in on such short notice," he said, gesturing for them to sit around a conference table where he had already set up a laptop and projector. "Your phone call was quite intriguing. It's not often that we hear about private collections of Cold War intelligence materials, especially ones that might relate to Operation Gold." Elizabeth inserted her flash drive and began displaying the images she had captured, starting with the photographs of the Operation Gold team and the various maps spread throughout Warren's cabin and workshop. Dr. Harmon's expression grew increasingly focused as each image appeared on the projection screen. "This is remarkable," he said after examining the photograph labeled as the Operation Gold team. "The clothing equipment and photographic techniques all appear consistent with the mid-1950s period. If this is authentic, it would be one of the clearest group photographs of the Berlin Tunnel operation team that I've ever seen." The hand-drawn maps provoked an even stronger reaction. Dr. Harmon leaned forward, studying the detailed geographical features and symbolic notations with the intensity of someone examining a significant archaeological find. "These are extraordinary," he said after reviewing the entire collection. "The level of geographical detail suggests someone with extensive first-hand knowledge of the terrain, probably acquired over many years of direct observation. But more significantly, these locations correspond to known intelligence sites associated with the Cold War operations in the 1950s and 60s. He pulled out a reference book and began comparing some of the mapped locations to documented historical sites. "Here, for instance," he said, pointing to a distinctive underground structure depicted in one of Warren's maps. "This appears to be a section of the Berlin Tunnel that hasn't been publicly documented before. The level of detail suggests your uncle had direct access to operational blueprints." Hannah leaned forward with interest. "So Uncle Warren was mapping secret intelligence operations?" "It appears so," Dr. Harmon confirmed. "But more than that, he seems to have been documenting locations with a systematic precision that suggests he was looking for something specific. These aren't tourist maps or casual historical interest. This is the work of someone conducting a serious intelligence research operation." Elizabeth displayed the images of the leather journal they had found hidden beneath the cabin floor. Though the faded handwriting was difficult to read even in the high-resolution scans, Dr. Harmon examined the pages carefully, occasionally commenting on details that weren't obvious to untrained eyes. The handwriting style and ink type are consistent with mid-20th century military documentation, he observed. The paper appears to be of good quality, the type that would have been used for official records. Some of these entries mention specific dates and locations that I recognize from Operation Gold research. He paused at one particular page where the handwriting was clearer than most. This entry mentions the Berlin cache and gives what appears to be specific geographical coordinates. Berlin was indeed a center for intelligence operations during the Cold War, with numerous equipment caches and safe houses scattered throughout the divided city. Grace pointed to a symbol that appeared repeatedly throughout the journal pages. What does that mark mean? It shows up in a lot of different places. Dr. Harmon studied the symbol, a distinctive combination of lines and dots that appeared beside many of the geographical references. I'm not certain, but it resembles marking systems used by military cartographers in that era. It might indicate cache locations, listening posts, or other significant intelligence assets. The implications were beginning to crystallize in Elizabeth's mind. What if Warren hadn't simply been collecting historical materials about Cold War operations, but actually pursuing specific leads about hidden caches or buried intelligence assets? Harmon, Elizabeth said carefully. In your professional opinion, what kind of value might materials like this have? I mean, both historically and potentially financially. The professor considered the question thoughtfully. From a historical perspective, if these materials are authentic, they would be extremely significant. We have very few primary source documents from covert Cold War operations, and photographs of this quality are exceptionally rare. Any major museum or university would be very interested in acquiring or displaying such a collection. He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. As for financial value, that's more complex. The market for Cold War historical artifacts can be quite strong, especially among private collectors. Authentic photographs from Operation Gold could be worth tens of thousands of dollars, possibly more, if they can be definitively authenticated and provenanced. Elizabeth felt her heart rate increase at the mention of such substantial amounts. Even a fraction of that value would solve their immediate financial crisis and provide security she hadn't dared to hope for since Douglas's death. But Dr. Harmon continued, authentication would be crucial. The market is unfortunately full of reproductions and fraudulent materials. Any serious evaluation would require detailed analysis by experts in period photography, paper analysis, ink dating, and other specialized techniques. Hannah raised another question that had been bothering Elizabeth. What about the maps and stuff that show where caches might be hidden? Like, what if Uncle Warren actually found real Cold War treasures? Dr. Harmon smiled at the question, but his response was surprisingly serious. That's not as far-fetched as it might sound. There are documented cases of Cold War intelligence caches being discovered even in recent decades. During heightened tensions, both American and Soviet intelligence agencies established equipment caches, document drops, and emergency supplies in various remote locations. Most of these caches were never recovered either because the operations were abandoned or because the locations were too well hidden. He pulled out another reference book and showed them a map of documented intelligence sites throughout Europe and North America. Modern historians and intelligence researchers continue to search for these sites. The challenge is that most of the original operatives took their secrets to the grave, and the terrain in these areas has often changed dramatically over the decades. Grace studied the reference map, comparing it to the images of Warren's hand-drawn charts. Some of these places look like the same locations Uncle Warren was mapping. Indeed they do, Dr. Harmon agreed. Your uncle appears to have been conducting the kind of systematic research that professional historians and intelligence researchers have attempted for decades. The difference is that he had access to primary source materials, this journal, and these photographs that might have provided leads unavailable to other researchers. Elizabeth found herself facing a decision that felt overwhelming in its implications. The responsible course would be to have the materials professionally authenticated, then either donate them to a museum for the tax benefits or sell them to collectors for whatever financial return they might provide. But there was another possibility that Dr. Harmon's comments had made explicit. What if Warren had actually been successful in his research? What if the maps and journals didn't just document historical locations, but provided specific information about cache sites that had never been discovered? To Harmon, Elizabeth asked hypothetically if someone wanted to investigate whether any of these mapped locations might contain actual hidden caches. How would they go about it? I mean, safely and legally. The professor leaned back in his chair, clearly intrigued by the direction of the conversation. That's a complex question involving legal, practical, and safety considerations. First, you'd need to determine land ownership for any sites you wanted to investigate. Much of the terrain is now public land, national forests, BLM land state parks, which have strict regulations about metal detecting and excavation. He pulled out a legal pad and began sketching a rough flowchart. You'd need permits for any serious investigation, proper equipment for remote area exploration, and ideally partnerships with academic institutions or museums that could provide expertise and legitimacy to any discoveries. Hannah was clearly excited by these possibilities. So it's like a real treasure hunt, but with rules and stuff. Exactly, Dr. Harmon confirmed. Modern historical investigation, when done properly, is a combination of historical research, legal compliance, and careful archaeological technique. The goal isn't just to find valuable items, but to preserve historical context and ensure any discoveries contribute to our understanding of the past. Elizabeth realized that they had moved far beyond the simple property evaluation that had brought them to California. What had started as a desperate attempt to salvage some value from an inherited cabin had evolved into the possibility of pursuing an actual intelligence cache hunt based on research that Warren had spent decades developing. Harmon, Elizabeth said, making a decision that surprised even herself. Would you be interested in some kind of partnership or consultation arrangement? We clearly need expert guidance, and you seem to understand the historical significance of what we've found. The professor's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm she imagined he usually reserved for significant research opportunities. Mrs. Cooper, I have to tell you that this is exactly the kind of project that drew me to Cold War studies in the first place. The combination of historical research, field investigation, and the possibility of significant discoveries is irresistible from an academic standpoint. What would be the next steps? Elizabeth asked, feeling simultaneously terrified and exhilarated by the path they seemed to be choosing. Dr. Harmon began outlining a systematic approach that would balance academic rigor with practical historical investigation techniques. First, we need to complete the authentication process for the historical materials, both to establish their credibility and to provide detailed information for research purposes. Then we'd analyze the maps and journal entries to identify the most promising locations for initial investigation. He paused, studying Elizabeth's expression carefully. I should mention that Stanford University has discretionary research funds that could support this kind of historical investigation. If we structure this as an academic project, we might be able to cover expenses for equipment travel and other costs while ensuring any discoveries are properly documented and preserved. There's one more thing you should consider, De Harmon added. If we do discover significant intelligence caches, the historical value could be substantial. Depending on the contents and legal ownership issues, we could be talking about discoveries worth hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. They left the university campus that afternoon. Elizabeth felt as if their entire world had shifted on its axis. The struggling widow who had reluctantly driven to California to dispose of worthless inherited property was now contemplating a systematic historical investigation based on Cold War intelligence research that might solve all their financial problems while contributing to academic understanding of American intelligence history. For the first time since Douglas's death, Elizabeth felt genuinely hopeful about their future, though she also recognized that they were embarking on something far more complex and uncertain than anything she had ever attempted. As they approached their car in the university parking lot, Elizabeth noticed a dark sedan with government plates parked nearby, and a man in a suit who seemed to be watching them with particular interest. When their eyes met briefly, he quickly looked away and began speaking into what appeared to be a radio or communication device. A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine as she ushered her daughters into their Toyota. Uncle Warren's research wasn't just of historical interest, it clearly contained information that might still be sensitive after all these decades. And now that they had started asking questions and showing the materials to academic experts, It seemed they had attracted attention from quarters she hadn't anticipated. The first major breakthrough came 3 days later, back in the dusty confines of Warren's workshop, where Elizabeth and Dr. Harmon had been systematically cataloging and photographing every document, map, and artifact they could find. Hannah had discovered additional keys hidden inside a metal ammunition box on one of the workbenches, and these opened the locked filing cabinets that had tantalized them since their first visit to the property. The contents of those cabinets transformed their understanding of Warren Cooper, from an eccentric hermit pursuing a historical hobby into something approaching a professional intelligence researcher with access to resources and information that seemed impossible for a solitary mountain dweller. The files were meticulously organized with folders labeled by location date ranges and what appeared to be a complex cross-referencing system that connected geographical sites with historical events and documented intelligence activities. This was clearly the work of someone with professional training in intelligence analysis and document management. This is incredible. Your uncle had connections we're only beginning to understand. These operational reports should be in the CIA's historical archives in Langley. Technical diagrams from this period are typically held in military engineering archives or classified storage facilities. The level of access required to obtain copies of these materials suggests either extensive research relationships or he had inside access to institutional archives that most researchers never see. Academic researchers can request access to historical materials, but what we're seeing here represents years of systematic collection from multiple sources across several agencies with different classification systems. What about this? It's marked personal correspondence confidential, and it feels like there are letters inside. Elizabeth carefully opened the envelope, finding a collection of handwritten letters dating from the 1970s through the early 2000s. The correspondence appeared to be between Warren and various individuals discussing historical research, document authentication, and what could only be described as collaborative intelligence cache recovery efforts. One letter dated 1983 was particularly revealing. Warren, the Nevada expedition was more successful than we hoped. The metal detector readings and coordinates you provided were exactly as predicted. We recovered several items that authenticate the site as a genuine corona drop location. Your father's journal continues to prove accurate beyond our expectations. The university connection will provide legitimacy for future investigations while protecting our primary objectives. Regards, Thomas. This suggests that Warren was working with other people and that they actually owned something at locations described in that old journal. This is fascinating. It appears your uncle was part of a network of researchers and former intelligence personnel who were systematically investigating Cold War cache sites based on primary source materials. It says your father's journal. So that old journal we found wasn't even Warren's research, it belonged to his father. The revelation recontextualized everything they had discovered. If the leather journal with its detailed geographical notations and coded references belonged to Warren's father, it would have been created by someone who lived and worked during the actual Cold War operations, possibly someone with direct knowledge of intelligence activities and cache locations. Dr. Harmon, if Warren's father was documenting intelligence activities in the 1950s and 60s, what would that suggest about his relationship to those operations? There are several possibilities. He could have been a military officer, an intelligence operative, a technical specialist supporting covert operations, or someone involved in legitimate support activities for these operations. Or he could have been one of them, like maybe Great-Grandpa Cooper was an actual spy who worked for the CIA. It's not impossible. The intelligence community included thousands of operatives over the years, and many of their identities were never publicly disclosed. If someone from that period had specialized knowledge of cache locations and preserved detailed records, it would explain both the accuracy of these materials and the systematic nature of the research we're seeing. Elizabeth found another letter that seemed to support this theory, dated 1991. It discussed authenticity verification and mentioned that DNA analysis confirms the family connection, validating the provenance of the source materials. The letter was signed by someone at a private laboratory in Denver, suggesting that Warren had actually undertaken scientific verification of his family's historical claims. As they continued examining the correspondence, a pattern emerged of systematic historical investigations conducted over several decades. The letters referenced successful recoveries at multiple sites, partnerships with academic institutions that provided legitimate cover for the investigations, and careful legal procedures for handling discovered artifacts and equipment. One letter from '98 contained information that made Elizabeth's hands tremble as she read it. The Nevada site excavation exceeded all expectations. Total recovery value approximately $340,000 in period currency and technical equipment. University partnership ensured proper documentation, while private sale arrangement provided funding for future expeditions. Your percentage of $85,000 has been deposited to the designated account as agreed. Your uncle wasn't just researching historical sites. He was funding systematic intelligence cash recovery operations that were generating substantial returns. And these weren't random searches, but targeted investigations based on specific historical intelligence. Mom, look at this. It shows total recoveries of over $1.7 million since 1975. Uncle Warren was making serious money from this cash hunting. The implications were staggering. Elizabeth had inherited not just a remote cabin and some historical documents, but what appeared to be the operational base for a successful intelligence cash recovery enterprise that had been generating substantial income for decades. More importantly, the systematic nature of the records suggested that many potential sites remained unexplored, representing future opportunities that might be even more valuable than past successes. This is remarkable. Your uncle appears to have spent years preparing for one major expedition to a location he believed contained the largest undiscovered cache from the Corona program. The map showed an area of remote desert country about 70 miles northwest of Las Vegas, marked with multiple approach routes, geological surveys, and what appeared to be security considerations for conducting excavation work without detection. Attached to the map were copies of land ownership records confirming that the target area was on public land where properly permitted archaeological work would be legal. Harmon, based on what we're seeing here, what would be involved in pursuing this primary objective that Warren was planning? This would be a major undertaking requiring proper archaeological permits, specialized equipment, significant time investment, and careful attention to safety procedures for remote area work. Your uncle had consulted with professional archaeologists, obtained geological surveys of the target area, and even arranged for ground-penetrating radar analysis of specific sites. This isn't amateur treasure hunting, it's a professional-grade expedition planned with scientific rigor. Other parties have become aware of the Nevada project and may be planning competing investigations of the target area. What does that mean? It suggests that your uncle's research had attracted attention from other parties interested in Cold War intelligence artifacts. The professional historical research community is competitive, and information about significant potential discoveries can be valuable enough to motivate questionable behavior. There's something else. This is addressed to my heir and appears to have been intended as final instructions if something happened to prevent Warren from completing his research personally. If you are reading this, I have passed before completing the most important work of my life. The enclosed materials represent 40 years of research based on my father, Thomas Cooper's direct knowledge of Corona program drop locations. Thomas Cooper served with the CIA's Technical Services Division from 1952 to 1968 and documented 12 major equipment cache sites before his untimely death. The Nevada location contains not just currency and gold, but also equipment and documents that would rewrite the historical understanding of the Cold War intelligence period. The estimated value exceeds $20 million. But more importantly, successful recovery would establish our family's rightful place in intelligence history and provide security for future generations. The coordinates and detailed access instructions are encoded in Thomas's original journal, using a cipher key I have hidden separately for security purposes. We need to decode Thomas's journal, verify the historical accuracy of Warren's research, and develop a systematic plan for investigating the most promising sites. But we also need to proceed very carefully, both for safety reasons and because we may not be the only people interested in these locations. The code key proved to be hidden in a place so obvious that they had initially overlooked it. Grace discovered it purely by accident when she knocked over a metal box on Warren's workbench, spilling its contents across the floor. Among the scattered items was a folded piece of microfilm wrapped around a simple metal compass. Mom, look at this. It looks like some kind of code key or something. This is exactly what we need. With this key, we should be able to decode all the geographical references and site descriptions that have been puzzling us. Hannah began working on the translation using a notebook to convert the coded symbols in the journal's first entry into readable text. Her methodical approach quickly transformed the first passage from meaningless symbols into a coherent narrative. April 10, 1960. Following recovery of camera package at Groom Lake Technical Assessment confirms complete surveillance coverage of Soviet missile facility at Plesetsk. Gold package transferred to temporary storage at Weather Station 7 pending permanent relocation. Containment protocols established with McGrady and Parsons. Estimated value $750,000 in gold bullion plus technical equipment and documentation. This is astonishing. This references the Corona satellite program, America's first photo reconnaissance satellite system. They would eject film canisters from orbit, and specially equipped aircraft would catch them in midair. Sometimes these recovery operations failed, and backup recovery teams would retrieve the packages from the ground. But why does it mention gold? Was that standard for these operations? Not at all. Intelligence operations during this period were often compartmentalized with different aspects known only to those directly involved. But there were rumors of what we called black funds, untraceable assets used to finance covert operations without congressional oversight. Gold would be ideal for this purpose, valuable, portable, and difficult to trace. Hannah continued with the next entry, May 3, 1960. Situation critical following Powers incident. All assets at risk of exposure. Initiated emergency protocol. Zulu for immediate relocation of Weather Station 7 materials. Gold package and documentation transferred to Nevada Site Alpha. Coordinates 37 to G24 to 19 and 115 to G49 51W. McGrady missing presumed captured. Parsons and I will maintain isolation protocols until situation clarified. The Powers incident, that's Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot, shot down over Soviet territory on May 1, 1960. This was a major international crisis that severely damaged U.S.-Soviet relations. If your grandfather was involved in intelligence operations at that time, he would have been part of the emergency protocols activated in response to this incident. So my grandfather was hiding intelligence materials in gold. After a spy plane was shot down, it appears so. And if I'm reading this correctly, the Nevada coordinates he mentioned correspond to an area near what we now know as Area 51, specifically Groom Lake, which was a highly classified facility used for testing experimental aircraft and apparently for processing reconnaissance satellite materials. As the decoding continued, a disturbing pattern emerged. Thomas Cooper hadn't been simply documenting official intelligence operations, but chronicling his involvement in what appeared to be an unauthorized relocation of valuable assets following the U-2 crisis, May 18, 1960. Gold transfer complete. New storage facility established at coordinates 36 to G30 Winton 52 and 116 DG 1338 BW. Remote location ensures minimal detection risk. Construction of underground chamber completed with Parsons. All traces of activity eliminated per protocol. Official search for missing materials focused on northern sector due to my misdirection. Maintaining cover as technical consultant while monitoring situation. Harmon's expression grew increasingly troubled as he plotted these coordinates on a modern map. Mrs. Cooper, your grandfather appears to have been involved in something extremely sensitive. These new coordinates are in a remote area of the Nevada desert well away from any official installations. And the language he's using, misdirection and monitoring, suggests he may have been operating outside official channels. Like he was stealing the gold. I wouldn't jump to that conclusion yet, but he certainly seems to have been relocating valuable materials without obvious authorization. The question is why? Was this a sanctioned contingency plan, or was he acting on his own initiative? The next journal entry provided partial answers. June 2, 1960. Received coded message from director confirming project M-Culture funding at risk due to power situation. Our work must continue despite official cancellation. The gold will ensure operations proceed without interruption. Parsons concerned about oversight, but committed to program objectives. New security protocols established for Nevada site. Will maintain official role while directing resources to continue the research. M-Culture, isn't that Yes, one of the most controversial CIA programs of the Cold War era. Officially, it was a mind control and chemical interrogation research program that ran from 1953 until about 1973, though there are indications some aspects continued under different code names. The program was highly compartmentalized, with many operations conducted without proper oversight or documentation. The documents continued to reveal a disturbing narrative. Thomas Cooper had apparently been involved with the technical aspects of M-Culture, providing specialized equipment for what the journal euphemistically called cognitive modification research. When the U-2 incident threatened to expose various black operations, Cooper and his associates diverted gold bullion and technical equipment to continue their work outside official channels. Hannah looked up from her translation, her expression troubled. Mom, this doesn't sound like heroic spy stuff anymore. It sounds like Grandpa Cooper was involved in something really sketchy. Elizabeth felt a growing unease as the true nature of her family connection to these materials became clear. Far from being the noble intelligence officer she had imagined, Thomas Cooper appeared to have been involved in some of the darkest aspects of Cold War intelligence operations and possibly in the misappropriation of government assets. Dr. Harmon, does this change how we should proceed if these materials are connected to questionable activities? It certainly complicates matters. Legally, you still inherit your uncle's possessions, including these documents. But if they reveal improper activities or the location of misappropriated government property, that raises ethical and potentially legal questions about recovery efforts. The decoding continued, revealing increasingly troubling details about Thomas Cooper's activities. September 15, 1960. Human trials proceeding at Nevada facility. Parsons has recruited 3 subjects from local institutions. Results promising but unpredictable. Gold reserves adequate for 5 years of continued research without official oversight. New compounds show significant impact on memory functions. Potential military applications obvious but require extensive testing. Official cover remains intact through university connections. Dr. Harmon paled visibly as he read this passage. This is extremely concerning. If your grandfather was conducting unauthorized human experiments as part of a rogue MK Ultra operation, that would constitute serious ethical violations, possibly crimes. And the reference to recruiting subjects from local institutions in the context of MK Ultra, that often meant psychiatric hospitals or prisons. What should we do? Should we even keep looking for this cache? That's a complex question. On one hand, these documents have significant historical value in revealing previously unknown aspects of controversial intelligence programs. On the other hand, if they lead to misappropriated government property or evidence of criminal activity, we have ethical obligations to consider. Before they could discuss further, a knock at the cabin door startled everyone. Elizabeth opened it to find a man in his mid-40s wearing a dark suit despite the mountain heat. He presented identification that identified him as Special Agent Marcus Davis of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mrs. Cooper, I'm Special Agent Davis with the FBI's Historical Artifacts Division. I understand you've recently inherited this property and have been examining some historical materials related to intelligence operations. How did you know that we monitor academic inquiries related to classified Cold War programs? Dr. Harmon's database searches at Stanford triggered an automatic alert. May I come in? I believe we have matters of mutual interest to discuss. Once inside, Agent Davis surveyed the documents spread across Warren's workbench with practiced efficiency. I see you've made significant progress with Warren Cooper's collection, and you've decoded Thomas Cooper's journal as well. That's further than most researchers have gotten. You knew about all this? We've been aware of Warren Cooper's research activities for some time, Mrs. Cooper. Your uncle operated in a gray area, not exactly illegal, but close enough to sensitive materials that we kept an eye on his activities. He was careful to maintain academic cover for his investigations, which is why we never had cause to intervene directly. But my grandfather, was he involved in illegal activities? Davis's expression remained neutral, but his tone softened slightly. Thomas Cooper's status is complicated. The programs he was involved with operated under different legal frameworks than we have today. What would now be clearly illegal was often technically authorized through classified channels during that period. Your grandfather was part of technical services for MKUltra, primarily developing recording and surveillance equipment. When the program faced potential exposure after the Powers incident, he was instructed to secure certain assets. So he was following orders when he hid the gold. Initially, yes. The official record indicates he was tasked with establishing a contingency cache in Nevada. However, after 1961, there's a gap in his official activities. When he resurfaced in the system in 1963, he was reassigned to less sensitive operations. The official story was that he suffered a nervous breakdown, but internal reviews suggested he may have diverted resources for unauthorized continuation of certain research protocols. And my uncle Warren was trying to find these hidden materials. Warren Cooper became convinced his father had been scapegoated to protect higher-level officials involved in MKUltra. He spent decades trying to locate the Nevada cache, believing it contained not just valuable assets, but documentation that would exonerate his father. From what we can tell, he identified several smaller caches, but never located the primary site. Then why are you here now? If you've known about this for years, because the situation has changed. We're not the only ones interested in these materials. A private military contractor called Sentinel Security has been pursuing the same research, but with less ethical constraints than your uncle maintained. They've recently increased their activities in the Nevada target area, and we have reason to believe they've identified the cache location. What do they want with Cold War materials? That's what concerns us. Sentinel is run by former intelligence personnel with connections to certain pharmaceutical research companies. MKUltra developed numerous chemical compounds for behavior modification and interrogation. The formulas for those compounds would be extremely valuable to private interests operating outside regulatory frameworks. So you want to find this cache before they do precisely, but we need your help. Your grandfather's journal contains the most detailed information available about the cache location. We've never been able to fully decode it until now. Dr. Harmon interjected with obvious skepticism. With all due respect, Agent Davis, the FBI, could easily have broken this code years ago if they'd wanted to. Why the sudden interest, and why involve civilians rather than mounting an official recovery operation? Davis's expression tightened momentarily. Because this operation exists in a bureaucratic gray area. Dr. Thomas Cooper's activities were never officially acknowledged. If we mount a formal FBI operation to recover these materials, we create an official record acknowledging their existence and the activities that created them. That opens doors to investigations, congressional hearings, and potential lawsuits from MKUltra victims. The Bureau prefers a more discreet approach. So you want us to do your dirty work. I'm proposing a partnership, Mrs. Cooper. You have legal claim to anything your uncle left, including his research. We have the resources to secure the site before Sentinel gets there. Together, we can ensure these materials are properly secured and historically documented without creating problematic official records. And what happens to the gold and the documents? The gold would be technically yours as the inheritor of Warren's research, though there would be tax implications. The documents and technical materials would need to be evaluated for ongoing security concerns, but historical materials could be properly archived through academic institutions like Dr. Harmon's department. Hannah and Grace had been listening intently to this exchange, and now Hannah spoke up with the directness of youth. This all sounds super shady, like you want us to help you cover up bad stuff the government did, and we get money for it, Agent Davis addressed Hannah directly, his tone respectful rather than condescending. Young lady history is rarely as clear-cut as we'd like it to be. The intelligence community of the 1950s and 60s operated under the belief that national security justified methods we now find troubling. I'm not asking you to cover anything up. I'm suggesting we recover historically significant materials in a way that allows proper historical documentation without creating a media circus that would prevent thoughtful evaluation of complex events. Elizabeth considered the proposition carefully. The financial implications were significant. If the cache contained the value Warren had estimated, it could solve their problems permanently. But the ethical questions troubled her deeply. If we did this, work with you, I'd want guarantees about the historical documentation. No bearing uncomfortable truths just because they're embarrassing to the government. That's a reasonable condition. We can draft an agreement specifying that all historical materials would be properly archived with copies maintained by both Stanford and the National Security Archive. Only technical materials with ongoing security implications would be restricted. Dr. Harmon remained skeptical. And Sentinel, you really believe they're close to finding the cache? Our intelligence indicates they've identified the general area and have been conducting ground surveys using advanced subsurface radar. They're being careful to maintain cover as a geological research team, but they've brought in equipment consistent with excavation operations. We estimate they're within days of pinpointing the exact location. The following morning found Elizabeth, Dr. Harmon, and Agent Davis hunched over detailed topographical maps in Warren's workshop, comparing the decoded coordinates from Thomas Cooper's journal with modern satellite imagery of the Nevada desert. The final journal entries we decoded suggest Thomas established the cache in an abandoned mining tunnel network approximately 7 miles from the nearest access road. He specifically mentions reinforcing an existing shaft and creating a false collapse to conceal the entrance. That's consistent with these geological surveys Warren commissioned. This area shows a network of abandoned silver mining operations from the early 1900s. Most were considered depleted by 1920, but the tunnel infrastructure remained relatively stable due to the hard rock composition. Hannah and Grace had been working with additional journal entries, and now Hannah brought over her latest decoding. "Mom, I think I found something important." This entry from August 1961 talks about a secondary security protocol for the cache. Davis took the notebook and read aloud August 17, 1961. Implemented secondary security protocol at Nevada site. Primary entrance now secured with false collapse. Secondary entrance established through vertical shaft at coordinates offset 250 meters northeast from main entrance. Access requires specialized equipment, but provides emergency extraction route if primary entrance compromised. Only Parsons and I know of this contingency. This could be significant. Sentinel is focusing on the main tunnel entrance based on the geological anomalies. If we approach through this secondary entrance, we might be able to access the cache without alerting them to our presence. But we'd need specialized equipment for a vertical shaft descent. That's not exactly something we can improvise. I've taken the liberty of arranging for appropriate resources. I have a team of trusted contractors with caving and recovery experience on standby. They're operating undercover as a university geological survey team with all proper permits already secured. You've been planning this all along, haven't you? Even before you approached us. Let's say I believed in being prepared for various contingencies, Mrs. Cooper. But I need your cooperation and specifically the complete decoding of your grandfather's journal to proceed effectively. The full decoding of Thomas Cooper's journal took another full day of intensive work with Hannah and Grace, proving remarkably adept at applying the cipher key to the coded text. The complete narrative that emerged painted a disturbing picture of a rogue MK Ultra operation that continued for nearly 3 years after official scrutiny should have shut it down. Thomas Cooper and his associate Parsons had diverted approximately $3 million in gold bullion, specialized technical equipment, and chemical compounds to their hidden facility. They're insulated from oversight. They had continued behavioral modification experiments with what the journal clinically referred to as involuntary test subjects. The more they decoded, the more troubled Elizabeth became about her family connection to these activities. This was far from the heroic intelligence work she had initially imagined when discovering Warren's research. "I don't understand how my uncle could have spent decades researching this without being disturbed by the ethical implications. These experiments sound horrific." Agent Davis provided context from FBI files. Warren Cooper appears to have been selective in what he decoded from his father's journal. Based on his notes, he focused primarily on the technical aspects and cache locations rather than the operational details. He may have been protecting his father's legacy even from himself. Dr. Harmon offered another perspective. It's also possible he was more interested in exonerating his father than exposing the full scope of the program. There are indications Thomas Cooper eventually developed misgivings about the work. The later journal entries show increasing concern about the ethical implications and references to documenting everything for eventual disclosure when appropriate. The preparations for the Nevada expedition proceeded with methodical efficiency under Agent Davis's direction. Within 3 days, they had assembled in a remote staging area about 15 miles from the target location. The FBI's contractors, whom Elizabeth strongly suspected were either current or former Bureau personnel, had established a convincing cover as a Stanford University geological survey team, complete with branded vehicles and equipment. The plan for approaching the cache site had been refined based on satellite reconnaissance that confirmed Sentinel's presence in the area. The private security firm had established what appeared to be a mining survey camp near the primary tunnel entrance, identified in Thomas Cooper's journal, with round-the-clock personnel and sophisticated ground-penetrating radar equipment. Davis outlined their approach as they gathered around satellite imagery displayed on a ruggedized laptop. Sentinel has focused their efforts here at the main tunnel entrance. They've established a security perimeter with regular patrols, but they're maintaining a low profile to avoid attracting attention. Our advantage is the secondary entrance. Thomas Cooper created this vertical shaft located approximately 250 meters northeast of their position. Elizabeth studied the barren landscape on the satellite image, a harsh expanse of rock and scrub that seemed to conceal its secrets well. How do we access this shaft without being detected? There's hardly any cover out there. We'll approach at night using this dry wash for concealment. It takes us within 50 meters of the shaft location. From there, we use the natural rock formations for cover during the final approach. The shaft itself appears to be concealed under what looks like a natural rock formation based on Thomas's description. Dr. Harmon examined the geological data with a professional eye. These old mining complexes can be dangerous. Unstable supports, poor air quality, potential for collapse. Are we certain this is safe? Thomas Cooper was meticulous in his documentation. He reinforced the main tunnels with steel supports and installed a basic ventilation system. According to his final entries, he conducted regular maintenance visits until at least 1963. But you're right about the potential hazards, which is why we're bringing specialized equipment and personnel with extensive cave rescue training. The expedition team departed from their staging area at dusk, traveling in 2 unmarked vehicles with darkened windows. Elizabeth had initially insisted that Hannah and Grace remain behind, but the girls had argued so persuasively about their essential role in continuing to decode journal entries that she had reluctantly agreed to their presence at the base camp, though they would not participate in the actual tunnel exploration. As they approached the final staging point about a mile from the target, Davis instructed everyone to maintain radio silence, except for emergency communications. From here, they would proceed on foot using night vision equipment to navigate the terrain. Elizabeth felt a surreal disconnection as she donned the military-grade night vision goggles Davis provided. Just 2 weeks ago, she had been a struggling widow facing foreclosure. Now she was sneaking through the Nevada desert at night, participating in what amounted to a covert intelligence operation to recover materials hidden by her grandfather during the Cold War. The small team moved efficiently through the darkness following the dry wash that provided both concealment and easier terrain for walking. Besides Elizabeth, Dr. Harmon, and Agent Davis, the group included 3 men Davis had introduced only by first names: Mike, Tony, and James, who moved with the disciplined quiet of military or law enforcement training. After approximately 40 minutes of careful progress, Davis signaled for the group to halt. Ahead, barely visible, even with night vision, was a cluster of lights marking the Sentinel camp near the main tunnel entrance. They were still several hundred meters away, but close enough that sound might carry in the desert night. From here, we proceed with extreme caution. No talking, hand signals only. The shaft entrance should be approximately 200 meters to our northeast behind that rock outcropping. The final approach took another 20 minutes of painstakingly careful movement, using natural terrain features for concealment. Finally, they reached a small plateau ringed by weathered boulders that matched the description in Thomas Cooper's journal. This is it. According to the journal, the shaft entrance is concealed beneath what appears to be a natural rock formation, specifically a flat stone approximately 1 meter in diameter that can be moved with appropriate leverage. The team methodically examined the area looking for anything matching this description. It was Dr. Harmon who eventually identified a promising candidate, a flattish stone that seemed slightly different in color from the surrounding rocks when examined with their specialized lighting. With careful application of modern lifting equipment, the stone moved aside more easily than expected, revealing a dark opening approximately 1 meter in diameter. Cool air wafted up from the shaft, suggesting connection to a larger underground space. Davis directed the team's next actions with practiced efficiency. Mike secure the anchor points for descent. Tony conduct air quality testing before anyone goes down. James established perimeter security in case we've been observed. Dr. Harmon, you'll monitor communications from here. Mrs. Cooper and I will make the initial descent once safety is confirmed. Elizabeth felt a surge of apprehension as she watched the preparations for entering the shaft. She had never done anything remotely like this before, descending into an abandoned mine shaft created as part of a secret Cold War operation. But her determination to understand her family's connection to these events overrode her fear. The air quality test showed adequate oxygen levels and no dangerous gases, though the atmosphere below was stale after decades without circulation. With the anchor points secured, Davis prepared to make the initial descent, equipped with a helmet-mounted light and communication gear. According to Thomas's measurements, the shaft is approximately 12 meters deep, connecting to a horizontal tunnel that joins the main mining complex. I'll go first to verify structural integrity, then signal when it's safe for you to follow. Davis disappeared into the darkness with practiced ease, the rope paying out smoothly through the mechanical descent device. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, his voice came through the communication system. Shaft is clear and structurally sound. There's a horizontal tunnel at the bottom with recent footprints in the dust. Someone's been here before us. Elizabeth felt her heart rate accelerate. If someone had already accessed the tunnel, they might be too late to secure the cache. But who had found this hidden entrance? Are they Sentinel's footprints? Have they found this entrance too? I don't think so. There are only two sets, and they appear to be at least a week old based on the dust settlement. They proceed from the shaft toward the main tunnel complex. Prepare to descend. With guidance from Mike, Elizabeth made her own descent into the darkness. The experience was disorienting, surrounded by absolute blackness beyond the cone of her headlamp, feeling the rough stone walls occasionally brush against her as she was lowered steadily downward. Finally, her feet touched solid ground, and she found herself in a low tunnel, roughly 2 meters high and slightly wider. Davis was examining the footprints with a small measuring tool. Two individuals, one larger than the other. They knew exactly where they were going, headed directly toward the main cache location based on these tracks. But they didn't return this way. Who else would know about this entrance? I thought only your grandfather and his associate knew about it. That's what the journal indicated. But Parsons might have revealed the information to someone else over the years. Or there could have been documentation we haven't discovered yet. They proceeded cautiously along the horizontal tunnel, which showed signs of deliberate reinforcement with timber supports at regular intervals. After approximately 50 meters, they reached a junction where their passage intersected with a larger mining tunnel. Davis consulted a digital copy of the hand-drawn map they had decoded from Thomas's journal. According to this, the cache chamber should be approximately 75 meters to our left in what was originally an ore processing room. As they moved deeper into the mining complex, Elizabeth noticed that the tunnel showed signs of relatively recent maintenance, replaced support timbers, cleared debris, even modern ventilation tubing running along the ceiling in some sections. This doesn't look abandoned. Someone has been maintaining these tunnels. Davis examined the newer supports with obvious concern. This is recent work within the last few years, far more extensive than just exploration. Someone has been systematically preparing these tunnels for regular access. They continued forward with increased caution alert for any sign of other presence in the tunnels. After another 50 meters, the passage widened into what had clearly once been a larger chamber. Mining equipment, long since abandoned, stood in rusted silence along the walls, but the center of the room had been cleared and modified. This matches Thomas's description of the ore processing room. The cache should be behind that false wall he constructed on the far side. The false wall was immediately apparent, a section of stone that looked slightly different from the surrounding rock, with a metal door set into it that had been camouflaged to match the stone texture. But as they approached, it became clear that the door was already partially open. Someone's beaten us to it. Davis drew a sidearm that Elizabeth hadn't realized he was carrying and approached the door with professional caution, using his non-dominant hand to slowly pull it open while keeping his weapon ready. The cache chamber beyond was approximately 5 meters square, reinforced with concrete and metal supports that gave it a bunker-like appearance. Metal shelving lined the walls and a large safe stood in the center of the room. But any hope that they had arrived in time vanished immediately. The safe door hung open and many of the shelves stood empty, with only scattered papers and small items remaining. We're too late. The main materials are gone. Davis holstered his weapon and began methodically examining what remained. Elizabeth followed him into the chamber, immediately noting that while much had been taken, the room wasn't completely emptied. Several document boxes remained on the lower shelves, and various pieces of what looked like technical equipment were still present. They didn't take everything. Why would they leave these behind selective extraction? They took what they specifically wanted, likely the gold and the chemical formulas, and left material they considered less valuable. Elizabeth began examining the remaining documents, many of which were in protective plastic sleeves. They included experimental protocols, technical diagrams for specialized recording equipment, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be case files on individuals, identified only by numbers rather than names. These are research records from the MK Ultra experiments. Subject profiles, treatment protocols, outcome documentation. Davis looked up from his own examination of a technical manual. This is historically significant material. These kinds of detailed MK Ultra records were thought to have been destroyed in 1973 when Director Helms ordered the program documentation purged. This may be the most complete record of the program's actual operations ever discovered. Elizabeth opened another document box and found something unexpected, a series of black and white photographs showing men in medical settings, some apparently unconscious, others displaying what appeared to be extreme emotional states. The clinical detachment of the photography made the images all the more disturbing. These must be the test subjects. They look tortured. MK Ultra's methods were brutal by modern standards. They used everything from sensory deprivation to experimental hallucinogens to attempt to control and modify behavior. Most of the test subjects had no idea what was being done to them or why. As Elizabeth continued examining the photographs, she suddenly froze, staring at one image with growing horror. The photographs showed a young man, perhaps in his 20s, strapped to a chair with monitoring equipment attached to his head. Despite the distress evident in his features, she recognized him immediately from family photographs. This is Douglas's father, my husband's father, William Cooper. Davis took the photograph, examining it with sudden intensity. Are you certain? I've seen his military portrait 100 times on Douglas's desk. This is definitely him. But that's impossible. He was an Air Force navigator who died in a training accident in 1965. How could he be part of these experiments? They continued searching through the records with new urgency, eventually locating a file labeled Subject 47C. Inside were detailed records of behavioral modification protocols administered to William Cooper, including experimental drug treatments and something called directed memory reconfiguration. The final page of the file contained a typed report with a heading that sent chills through Elizabeth's termination report. Subject 47C, Cooper William J. Classification, Failed Protocol, Disposition, Memory Suppression Implemented, Subject redesignated for terminal phase testing, Simulation Scenario, Aircraft Malfunction during routine training exercise, Terminal Event executed 03/17/1965, Official record established through military channels. No complications. This can't be real. They're saying they killed him and covered it up as a training accident. That's insane. Davis read through the document with a grim expression. Unfortunately, it's consistent with what we know about the darkest aspects of these programs. When experiments produced unpredictable results, or subjects showed signs of breaking conditioning, there were protocols for terminal resolution to prevent exposure of the program. But why would they target William Cooper specifically? He was just a regular Air Force navigator. Elizabeth continued searching through the file, eventually finding a personnel assessment that provided the missing link. Subject 47C selected based on familial connection to TSD asset Cooper TJ. Potential for leveraging genetic factors in response patterns. Asset Cooper, unaware of subject selection to maintain operational security and prevent compromise of ongoing research. They used William because he was Thomas's brother. They experimented on him without Thomas even knowing about it. And when the experiments failed, they killed him and covered it up. The implications were staggering. Thomas Cooper hadn't just been a technical specialist supporting MK Ultra. He had unwittingly helped develop technologies that were used to experiment on his own brother. When Thomas discovered this betrayal, he diverted program resources and documentation, not just out of concern for the program's ethics in general, but because of the personal horror of his unwitting complicity in his brother's death. Dr. Harmon's voice came urgently through their communication system. We have a situation up here. Sentinel security vehicles are approaching the main tunnel entrance. At least 6 personnel heavily armed. They appear to be conducting a systematic sweep of the area. Elizabeth felt a surge of panic, but Davis remained calm. They must have detected our presence or been alerted by perimeter sensors we didn't identify. We need to extract immediately with whatever documentation we can carry. Focus on the experimental records in anything related to William Cooper. As they hastily gathered the most significant documents, Elizabeth discovered a small metal case hidden behind one of the shelving units. Inside was a journal different from the one they had already decoded, handwritten in normal text rather than cipher, and dated 1963. The first page contained a dedication that made her breath catch for my brother William, whom I failed to protect. This record will ensure the truth cannot remain buried forever. Thomas Cooper, 1963. Davis urged her forward as she clutched the journal. We need to move now. If Sentinel personnel enter the main tunnel complex, they'll likely discover this chamber shortly thereafter. Their retreat through the tunnels was far more urgent than their careful approach had been. When they reached the vertical shaft, they could hear faint sounds of activity from the direction of the main tunnel entrance, voices and equipment being moved. Davis secured Elizabeth's harness to the ascent line. You go first with the documentation. I'll follow and cover our exit. The ascent seemed agonizingly slow, the mechanical pulley system lifting her steadily, but not quickly enough to outrun her growing fear. Finally, hands reached down to help her out of the shaft opening into the cool night air, where Dr. Harmon and Mike were waiting anxiously. Sentinel forces have entered the main tunnel complex. We need to be gone before they discover the connection to this shaft. Where's Davis? He's right behind me. But as the minutes ticked by with no sign of Agent Davis emerging from the shaft, concern grew. Finally, Mike leaned over the opening and activated the communication system. Davis, what's your status? The response came through with noticeable interference. Proceed with extraction immediately. I'm initiating Protocol Omega to secure remaining materials. Sentinel personnel have reached the junction and are proceeding toward the cache chamber. Do not wait for me. I have an alternate extraction route. Cooper family documentation is priority 1. Elizabeth protested. We can't just leave him down there. Dr. Harmon gripped her arm firmly. Agent Davis knows what he's doing. Protocol Omega is likely a destruction protocol to prevent sensitive materials from falling into unauthorized hands. He's buying us time to escape with the critical documentation. Reluctantly, Elizabeth allowed herself to be guided away from the shaft opening. The team moved quickly back through the darkness toward their vehicles, maintaining the same careful approach they had used coming in, but with greater urgency. As they reached the dry wash that would lead them back to their extraction point, a muffled explosion sounded from the direction of the mine, and a small dust cloud rose visible even in the darkness. Davis just collapsed part of the tunnel system. He's covering our tracks. They reached their vehicles without incident and departed immediately, following a different route from their approach to avoid potential Sentinel security checkpoints. As they drove through the darkness back toward their base camp, Elizabeth clutched the metal case containing Thomas Cooper's personal journal, struggling to process the night's revelations. The Cold War intelligence operations she had imagined as somewhat glamorous spy work had turned out to be something far darker: unethical experimentation, family betrayal, and murder, disguised as accident. And her husband Douglas, who had died so suddenly of what doctors called a brain aneurysm, was the son of a man who had been subjected to experimental behavioral modification before being eliminated by the very program her grandfather had supported. Dr. Harmon noticed her distress. Mrs. Cooper, are you all right? I'm not sure I'll ever be all right again after what we found tonight. My father-in-law was murdered by a government program my grandfather helped create. And my husband died of a sudden brain aneurysm at 39, just like his father was supposed to have died in an accident. That can't be coincidence. Let's not jump to conclusions. We need to examine all the documentation carefully. There may be explanations we haven't considered yet, but Elizabeth couldn't shake the growing suspicion that her husband's death might be connected to the dark legacy of MK Ultra, that whatever had been done to William Cooper might have had effects that carried through to his son. The timing of Douglas's death, the similar symptoms, the unexplained headaches he had suffered in the months before, it all suggested a connection too strong to ignore. When they reached the base camp, Hannah and Grace rushed to meet them, their faces showing the strain of waiting without communication. Mom, You're okay. What happened? Where's Agent Davis? Elizabeth hugged her daughters tightly, unsure how much to share about the night's discoveries. We found the cache, but someone had already taken most of the contents. Agent Davis stayed behind to secure the site. He'll join us later. As they unloaded the documentation they had recovered, Elizabeth began organizing the materials with Dr. Harmon's help. The case files on MK-Ultra experiments were disturbing enough, but it was Thomas Cooper's personal journal that drew her attention most strongly. Unlike his coded operational journal, this was a private record of his growing horror at discovering his unwitting role in his brother's death. The entries painted a picture of a man torn between loyalty to his country and the devastating revelation that the program he had supported had betrayed him in the most personal way possible. Thomas had apparently discovered William's involvement only after his brother's accident, when he gained access to secured program files during the confusion following the U-2 incident. October 14, 1963. I continued to gather evidence of Director Gottlieb's direct knowledge of William's selection for the program. He authorized the use of my own equipment designs on my brother, while assuring me my work was being used only on volunteer subjects from military personnel. The magnitude of this betrayal cannot be overstated. They used my own brother as a laboratory animal, then disposed of him when the results proved unstable. I will ensure this crime does not remain buried, even if documentation must remain secured until those responsible are beyond earthly justice. As Elizabeth continued reading, she found entries that shifted from documentation of past events to active concern about ongoing surveillance. November 3, 1963. Surveillance of my residence has increased. Parsons warns that our extraction of program materials has been noted, though the full extent remains unknown to leadership. I have implemented security protocols for all documentation and advised William's widow to relocate with young Douglas to reduce potential targeting. The boy shows no signs of effects from his father's treatment, but monitoring will continue discreetly to ensure his well-being. Elizabeth felt a chill at the mention of Douglas as a child. Thomas Cooper had apparently maintained some form of surveillance over his nephew, concerned about potential effects from whatever had been done to William. The journal continued with entries spanning years documenting Thomas's gradual withdrawal from official duties and establishment of his remote residence, the very cabin Warren had later occupied, to secure the documentation and maintain his vigil over the Cooper family from a distance. The later entries became increasingly paranoid, suggesting Thomas believed the remaining M-Culture leadership had identified him as the source of the missing materials and were monitoring his activities. His final entry, dated June 1968, reflected both resignation and determination. June 17, 1968. Surveillance has become constant. My position is no longer tenable within the organization. I have arranged transfer of all documentation to secure location at Nevada site, accessible only through protocols known to me. Warren has been briefed on contingency measures should my status change unexpectedly. Douglas continues to develop, normally showing no apparent effects of William's treatments. I pray this remains the case, though genetic transmission of certain modifications remains theoretically possible according to Parsons' research. I have failed to bring those responsible to justice in my lifetime, but I have preserved the evidence. The truth will eventually emerge. Thomas Cooper had disappeared shortly after this final entry, officially listed as killed in a car accident, but with a body too badly burned for proper identification. Warren had apparently spent decades pursuing his father's research, trying to locate the documentation that would reveal the truth about M-Culture's darkest operations and his family's unwitting role in them. As dawn approached with still no word from Agent Davis, Elizabeth made a decision that surprised even herself. Gathering Hannah Grace and Dr. Harmon, she laid out her concerns directly. I believe Douglas's death wasn't natural. These documents suggest his father was subjected to experimental treatments that might have genetic effects. Douglas died of exactly the same type of sudden cerebral event that these files describe as a potential long-term outcome of certain M-Culture protocols. That can't be coincidence. Dr. Harmon remained cautious. It's a disturbing possibility, but we need more evidence before concluding there's a direct connection. Many of these experimental protocols were poorly documented, and long-term effects were rarely studied systematically. Hannah, who had been examining the technical documentation they had recovered, suddenly called their attention to a file she had been reviewing. Mom, look at this. It's a research summary on something called Project Inheritance. It talks about transgenerational transmission vectors and delayed onset neurological markers. The document Hannah had found was a technical summary of research conducted under Thomas Cooper's reluctant supervision research, specifically focused on whether certain chemical compounds could create changes that would affect not just the test subject, but potentially their offspring as well. The summary included a list of test subjects and their known descendants, with surveillance recommendations extending to the second generation. William J. Cooper was listed as Subject 47C, and Douglas Cooper was identified as Generation 2 Monitor Subject 47C1, with a notation for mandatory surveillance protocols through developmental milestones and potential stress-induced activation periods. This isn't just about historical records anymore. This is about my husband's death, and potentially about Hannah and Grace's health as well. If whatever they did to William affected Douglas, it could affect my daughters too. Before Dr. Harmon could respond, the satellite phone they had been using for emergency communications rang sharply. Elizabeth answered to hear Agent Davis's voice, strained but coherent. "Mrs. Cooper, we have a situation. I managed to exit through an emergency shaft, but Sentinel personnel are actively searching the area. They recovered some of the documentation before I implemented the collapse protocol. More importantly, they have a team en route to your location. They've been tracking our communication signals. How did they know to look for us specifically? That's what concerns me. They seem to have specific knowledge about your family connection to the Cooper materials. Someone has been feeding them information beyond what they could have gathered independently. Then we need to leave immediately. No, you need to meet me at the secondary rendezvous point we established. Bring only the essential documentation, particularly anything related to William Cooper and Project Inheritance. I'll explain more when we meet, but you need to move quickly. Sentinel's advance team is less than an hour behind you." As they hastily packed the most critical documentation and prepared to depart, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that they were being manipulated, that Davis had known more about the Cooper family connection to MK Ultra than he had initially revealed. But with Sentinel forces apparently closing in, they had little choice but to follow his instructions and hope that the full truth would finally emerge at their next meeting. What they couldn't know as they drove away from the base camp was that Agent Davis was already at the secondary rendezvous point, but he wasn't alone. With him was an elderly man in a wheelchair whose gnarled hands clutched a folder stamped with a classification marking that had been obsolete for decades. Despite his age and frail appearance, his eyes were sharp and alert as he watched the road for their approach. The man looked down at the medical file in his lap, which bore the name Cooper Douglas J., and a project designation that had supposedly been purged from all official records, MK Ultra Inheritance. "They're coming," he said to Davis, "and it's time they learned what really happened to their father. What I did to their father, and why." The secondary rendezvous point was a weathered roadside motel 30 miles east of their base camp, its neon vacancy sign flickering weakly in the pre-dawn light. Elizabeth pulled their vehicle around to the back of the building as instructed, where Davis had secured rooms away from the main road and potential observation. "Mrs. Cooper, thank you for coming. We need to move quickly. Sentinel has extended their search pattern, and we have reason to believe they have identified your family connection to the MK Ultra materials." "Who's we, Agent Davis? You seem to be operating with more information and resources than you initially suggested. You're right to be suspicious. I haven't been entirely forthcoming about my authorization for this operation. This isn't an official FBI action, at least not in the conventional sense. So what is it, and who are you really working for?" "I still work for the Bureau, but this operation is being run through a special historical reconciliation unit that doesn't officially exist. We're tasked with resolving certain legacy issues from intelligence operations that have never been properly addressed. There's someone you need to meet who can explain the situation more completely." Davis led them to a room at the end of the building. Inside, seated in a wheelchair near the window, was an elderly man who appeared to be in his late 80s or early 90s. Despite his obvious physical frailty, his eyes were sharp and alert, studying Elizabeth and her daughters with unmistakable recognition. "This is Dr. Edward Parsons. He was your grandfather's colleague at Technical Services Division during the M-Culture period. He's been helping us locate and secure the remaining documentation from their joint projects." The name sent a jolt through Elizabeth. Parsons had been mentioned repeatedly in Thomas Cooper's journals as his primary collaborator, both in the official program and in the subsequent effort to document and conceal evidence of its worst excesses. You're the Parsons from my grandfather's journals. You helped him hide the MK Ultra materials. I did. And I've spent the last 50 years trying to make amends for my role in that program, Mrs. Cooper. Or may I call you Elizabeth? I've followed your family's progress for decades, though, from a necessary distance. The old man's voice was thin but steady, carrying the precise diction of someone who had spent a lifetime in scientific or academic work. He gestured toward a stack of files on the table beside him. I believe you've already discovered some of the documentation regarding your father-in-law, William Cooper, but you don't yet understand the full context of his involvement or how it relates to your husband's death and potentially to your daughter's future. You know what happened to Douglas? You know it wasn't a natural aneurysm I suspected as soon as I heard the circumstances of his death. The timing, the symptoms, the absence of prior indicators, it all matched the delayed effect profile we had documented in the second-generation subjects of Project Inheritance. Dr. Harmon interjected with obvious skepticism. You're suggesting Douglas Cooper's death was a direct result of experiments conducted on his father nearly 60 years ago? That seems scientifically implausible. Not to those of us who designed the compounds, Doctor. MKUltra wasn't just about mind control in the crude sense portrayed in popular media. The most advanced aspects of the program explored biochemical modifications that could create predetermined responses to specific triggers, sometimes decades after initial exposure. Parsons removed a file from the stack and opened it to reveal clinical documentation with William Cooper's name and service photograph. William was never a voluntary test subject. He was selected specifically because of his genetic relationship to Thomas, who was one of our most brilliant technical researchers. The program leadership theorized that genetically related individuals might respond similarly to certain compounds, providing comparative data points without the variables introduced by genetic diversity. So they used him as a lab rat because he was related to someone working on the program. That's monstrous. It was. And when Thomas discovered what had happened after William's accidental death, he was devastated. He had unknowingly helped develop technologies and protocols that were used on his own brother. That's when he made the decision to document everything and secure the evidence. And that's what's in the Nevada cache. The evidence of these experiments, most of it. Thomas and I relocated the most damning materials, particularly those related to genetic transmission effects. We were concerned about a specific aspect of Project Inheritance, the possibility that certain compounds could create latent neurochemical configurations that would be passed to offspring and could be triggered under specific conditions. Hannah, who had been listening intently, asked the question that was forming in Elizabeth's mind. Are you saying that whatever they did to our grandfather could affect us too? Parsons regarded the twins with an expression of genuine concern. It's possible. The research was preliminary, but there were indications that second-generation effects were more pronounced in female offspring due to specific interactions with hormonal development. We documented cases of unusual neurological sensitivity in the children of test subjects, particularly during adolescence and early adulthood. Dr. Harmon remained skeptical. This sounds more like science fiction than legitimate medical research. Even modern epigenetics doesn't suggest mechanisms for such specific transgenerational effects. That's because most of this research never entered the scientific mainstream. It was classified at levels beyond even normal intelligence restrictions. And the ethical implications were so severe that many of us who worked on it deliberately obscured or compartmentalized our findings. The old scientist's hands trembled slightly as he continued. Thomas and I spent years documenting these effects after we officially left the program. We maintained discrete monitoring of several family lines descended from test subjects, including William's son Douglas. We observed certain neurological markers that suggested potential vulnerability to specific trigger conditions. Elizabeth felt a surge of anger. You've been watching my family, monitoring my husband, my children, only from a distance and only to ensure their safety. Thomas was determined to protect his nephew from the potential consequences of what had been done to William. When Douglas began showing early indicators of the delayed effect syndrome, migraine patterns, sleep disturbances, occasional disorientation, Thomas became convinced that the second-generation effects were manifesting. That was around 1995, wasn't it? When Douglas started having those unexplained headaches, yes. Thomas approached your husband, discreetly suggesting medical tests that might identify the underlying condition without revealing the true context. But the standard medical diagnostics weren't designed to detect the specific neurochemical configurations we had created, and we feared that more specialized testing might attract attention from those who still monitored potential M-culture exposures. So you just watched while Douglas got sicker, while whatever this thing was that you created killed him. Parsons' expression reflected genuine remorse. We attempted to develop countermeasures based on our original research. Thomas devoted his final years to finding a way to neutralize the delayed effects. But without access to the original compound formulations, most of which were in the Nevada cache, our efforts were limited. When Thomas died in 2001, I continued the work alone, but with limited resources and declining health. Agent Davis, who had been monitoring communications on a secure laptop, interrupted with urgent news. We have a situation developing. Sentinel security forces have identified this location. Satellite imagery shows 3 vehicles approaching from the West ETA approximately 15 minutes. Parsons seemed unsurprised by this development. They've been tracking my movements for years. Victor Reynolds, Sentinel's director, was part of the original MK Ultra oversight team, one of the few who knew the full scope of Project Inheritance. He's been searching for the remaining documentation and compound samples since the program was officially terminated. The potential value of the behavior modification formulas to private military contractors is incalculable. So all this is about chemical formulas, mind control drugs, not just formulas. The Nevada cache contains the only remaining samples of several compounds that were developed under extreme secrecy, compounds that could theoretically be reverse engineered with modern techniques. Reynolds doesn't just want the historical documentation, he wants the actual chemical agents and the research on their transgenerational effects. Davis outlined their immediate options. We have 2 choices. We can attempt to evade Sentinel by relocating immediately to a secure facility I've arranged in Carson City, or we can implement the final phase of Operation Clean Slate. What's Operation Clean Slate? Parsons answered before Davis could explain. It's a reconciliation protocol that Thomas and I designed decades ago, a controlled release of specific MK Ultra documentation to congressional oversight committees, major media outlets, and academic institutions simultaneously and with sufficient authentication to prevent suppression. We created it as a dead man's switch to be activated if it appeared that the program's worst aspects might be revived or exploited. You've been planning this for decades. Waiting for what? Waiting for the right conditions, for a time when the release would lead to accountability rather than just another buried scandal. And for when we had located all the critical documentation, particularly regarding Project Inheritance and its second-generation effects. Elizabeth struggled to process the implications. What had begun as a desperate trip to inspect an inherited cabin had evolved into a complex intelligence operation with potential national security implications. But through it all, her primary concern remained her daughter's well-being. If what you're saying is true, then Hannah and Grace could be at risk from these same delayed effects that killed Douglas. That's my priority now, protecting my children, not exposing historical wrongs. That's why Operation Clean Slate includes a medical component. The documentation package includes the full technical specifications for the compounds used in Project Inheritance, along with the countermeasure protocols that Thomas and I developed. Releasing this information publicly ensures that appropriate medical interventions can be developed and made available to all descendants of test subjects, not just those who can be identified through classified records. And you believe this will work, that exposing all this won't just be buried again by people with an interest in keeping it secret. Davis answered with unexpected conviction. The political landscape has changed since these programs were active. Congressional oversight of intelligence operations is more robust, and public awareness of historical abuses makes cover-ups more difficult. More importantly, we've structured the release to make suppression virtually impossible. Too many independent recipients, too much authentication, too many parallel disclosure paths. Parsons added his own perspective. I've spent 50 years carrying the burden of what we did in the name of national security. Thomas died still seeking redemption for his unwitting role in his brother's death. This may be our last chance to ensure that the victims of these programs, including your husband and potentially your daughters, receive acknowledgement and proper medical attention. Hannah, who had been examining the technical documentation they had recovered, raised a critical question. These countermeasure protocols, do they actually work? Have they been tested? Parsons regarded her with a mixture of admiration for her insight and regret for the circumstances. They've been tested in a limited capacity on several identified second-generation cases. The results have been promising, sufficient to prevent acute manifestations similar to what your father experienced. But the long-term efficacy remains uncertain, particularly for third-generation cases, where the epigenetic markers may present differently. The decision point was rapidly approaching as Davis confirmed that Sentinel vehicles were now within 5 miles of their location. Elizabeth weighed their options, considering not just her family's immediate safety, but the broader implications of either course of action. If we implement this clean slate protocol, what happens to us? Are we just expected to go back to our lives and hope for the best? Davis had clearly anticipated this question. We've arranged comprehensive security and medical support through a specialized witness protection program. New identities, relocation, ongoing medical monitoring for Hannah and Grace, and financial compensation through a classified settlement program for victims of unauthorized intelligence operations. Grace, who had been characteristically quiet during much of the discussion, finally spoke up. So we just disappear. Leave everything behind. What about our home, our school, our friends? It would be a significant adjustment. But the alternative is continuing to live with uncertainty about your health, with Sentinel potentially tracking your family for years to come, and without the specialized medical monitoring that might be essential given your genetic heritage. Elizabeth asked the question that had been increasingly troubling her. And what about justice? The people who authorized these experiments, who used human beings like lab animals, and then disposed of them when they became inconvenient. What happens to them? Many are already deceased. Those who aren't will face exposure through the documentation release. Whether that leads to formal prosecution depends on the statutory limitations and the current administration's appetite for historical accountability. But at minimum, the historical record will be corrected and the victims acknowledged. As they prepared to depart for the secure facility Davis had arranged, Parsons asked for a moment alone with Elizabeth. Once the others had moved to prepare the vehicles, he handed her a small leather journal that looked decades old. This was Thomas's personal journal from the period immediately after he discovered William's involvement in the program. He wanted Douglas to have it someday when the full truth could be safely revealed. Now it should pass to you and your daughters. Elizabeth accepted the journal, recognizing its potential importance in understanding her family's complex connection to these historical events. There's something else you should know, something not documented in the official files. Thomas believed that William was specifically selected for the program not just because of his genetic relationship to Thomas, but because William had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see during a routine transport mission in 1958. What kind of mission? William was a navigator on aircraft that occasionally transported sensitive materials between research facilities. According to what Thomas pieced together, William inadvertently observed unauthorized testing on subjects at a remote facility in Nevada. His inclusion in Project Inheritance was partially a way to discredit him if he ever came forward by creating a documented history of mental instability and paranoid delusions. That's horrific. They experimented on him because he was a potential whistleblower. Essentially, yes. The program directors operated with almost complete autonomy during that period. They considered potential exposure of their methods a greater threat than the ethical violations the methods themselves represented. As they prepared to depart with Sentinel forces, now reported to be within visual range of the motel, Davis received an unexpected communication on his secure channel. We have a new complication. Bureau Oversight has been notified of unauthorized activities connected to this operation. Standard protocols have been suspended and were ordered to stand down and await extraction by official personnel. What does that mean in plain English? It means someone within the FBI has flagged our operation. The Bureau is sending official representatives to take control of the materials and presumably of us as well. This changes the calculations significantly. Parsons seemed unsurprised by this development. Reynolds has connections throughout the intelligence community. He's likely activated back-channel communications to halt our operation through official means. Once we're in official custody, the documentation could be classified under national security provisions and effectively buried. Davis made a rapid decision. We need to initiate clean slate immediately before official Bureau assets arrive. Once the information is released through all the predetermined channels, attempts to suppress it will only validate its authenticity. Parsons directed them to a specific file within the documentation they had recovered. The activation protocols are in the red folder marked Contingency Alpha. It contains authentication codes and transmission pathways for the secure distribution system we established. Once initiated, the process is automated and cannot be reversed. As Davis implemented the clean slate protocols using a specialized communications device, Elizabeth reviewed the personal journal Parsons had given her. The entries revealed Thomas Cooper's growing horror as he pieced together his brother's fate, his determination to document the truth, and his hope that someday the full story could be told without endangering William's descendants. One entry in particular caught her attention May 17, 1965. I have confirmed that William's accident was deliberate termination following unpredictable response patterns to compound K17. What they did not anticipate was that I had already secured samples of all experimental compounds, including K17 as part of my standard documentation protocols. These samples, properly preserved, may someday provide the key to understanding the long-term effects and potentially to developing countermeasures for William's son and any future generations affected by this abomination. I will protect this boy as best I can, even if from a distance. He deserves to grow up free from the shadow of what was done to his father. Elizabeth felt a complex mixture of emotions, grief for her husband, anger at the system that had treated her father-in-law as an expendable test subject, but also gratitude for Thomas Cooper's efforts to protect his nephew and document the truth. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles signaled that their time was running short. Davis confirmed that the clean slate protocol had been successfully initiated. Distribution sequence initiated. Primary document packages releasing to 17 predetermined secure channels. Secondary distribution will activate automatically in 1 hour if primary confirmation protocols aren't received. It's done. The information is beyond recall now. Parsons seemed to physically relax at this news, as if a burden carried for decades had finally been set down. Thomas would be pleased. This is what he worked for all those years, ensuring that the truth would eventually come to light, that the victims would be acknowledged, and that those affected could receive proper medical attention. As vehicles with official government markings pulled into the motel parking lot, Davis provided final instructions. When the Bureau representatives arrived, say nothing about clean slate. As far as they're concerned, we were simply securing historical documentation related to unauthorized intelligence operations. The distribution system is designed to be untraceable, so there's no way to connect it to this specific set of materials or to any of us individually. Elizabeth gathered Hannah and Grace close as heavy footsteps approached their door. Whatever happens next, remember that your father and your grandfather, William, were victims of something terrible, not willing participants. And your great-great-uncle Thomas spent his life trying to make it right. That's your heritage, not the experiments, but the determination to expose the truth and protect the family. The door opened to reveal several agents in formal FBI attire, led by a stern-looking woman in her 50s, who immediately addressed Davis. Agent Davis, you're operating outside authorized parameters. All personnel and materials are now under the direct jurisdiction of the Office of Professional Responsibility, pending review of potential unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Davis maintained a professional demeanor. Assistant Director Chambers. I was expecting Oversight Division, not OPR directly. These materials are historical documentation related to discontinued programs. There are no active operational details contained in these records. I'll be the judge of that, Agent Davis. All materials are to be secured immediately for classification review. Mrs. Cooper and her daughters will be escorted to a secure facility for debriefing regarding their exposure to potentially sensitive information. Parsons spoke up with surprising authority for someone in his frail condition. Before you proceed, Director Chambers, you should be aware that these materials document criminal activities conducted under intelligence cover not legitimate classified operations. The distinction is legally significant for your authority to classify them after the fact. The FBI official regarded Parsons with visible recognition. Dr. Parsons, I was briefed that you might be involved in this situation. Your perspective on the legal status of these materials is noted, but policy decisions will be made at the appropriate level after review. As the FBI personnel began securing the documentation, Elizabeth maintained a calm exterior while inwardly calculating their next steps. The clean slate protocol was already in motion. Within hours. The documentation would be in the hands of journalists, congressional oversight committees, and independent researchers. The truth about Project Inheritance and its victims would finally emerge regardless of any classification decisions made now. 6 months later, Elizabeth sat in a comfortable living room that still didn't quite feel like home watching a congressional hearing on television. The distinguished committee members were questioning a panel of historical intelligence experts about the recently revealed MKUltra documentation, particularly the aspects related to Project Inheritance and its unauthorized human testing. Hannah and Grace joined her on the couch, their expressions reflecting the complex journey they had experienced since that fateful trip to inspect Warren Cooper's remote cabin. Do you think anything will really change because of these hearings, Mom? Or is it just for show? I think some things have already changed. The medical monitoring program for descendants of test subjects has been established. You two have access to specialized screening and preventative treatments that weren't available before. And people like your grandfather William are finally being acknowledged as victims rather than just statistics in classified files. Grace gestured toward the window beyond which a discreet security detail maintained a watchful presence. And we're still living under protection with new names in a new state. Everything about our lives has changed. Not everything. We're still together. We still have each other. And now we have the truth about your father and his family, not just the tragedy that affected them, but the courage your great-great-uncle Thomas showed in documenting everything and protecting the family as best he could. The congressional testimony continued on a screen with a historian explaining the significance of the recently released documents. What makes the Project Inheritance documentation particularly significant is that it represents one of the few intact records of these experimental programs. When Director Helms ordered the destruction of MKUltra files in 1973, he effectively erased most of the official record. These preserved materials provide unprecedented insight into operations that were deliberately kept off the books. The doorbell rang and Elizabeth checked the security monitor before opening the door to admit Dr. Harmon, who had become a regular visitor in their new life. His academic expertise had proven invaluable in contextualizing the historical significance of the Cooper documentation, and he had developed a mentoring relationship with Hannah, whose interest in cryptography and historical research had intensified since their discoveries. The committee just called Parsons to testify. He's looking frail but remarkably composed for a man essentially confessing to decades of complicity in unauthorized human experimentation. He's made his peace with it. He spent 50 years trying to make amends for what he helped create. I don't know if that's enough to balance the scales, but it's something. And Davis, any word on his status? Still under internal review, but the word is he'll be quietly retired rather than prosecuted. The Bureau doesn't want the publicity of charging an agent who helped expose historical abuses, even if he operated outside proper channels to do it. The Evening News later featured a summary of Dr. Edward Parsons' testimony, including his direct apology to the families of test subjects and his detailed explanation of how Thomas Cooper had worked to document and eventually expose the unauthorized aspects of Project Inheritance. Most poignantly, Parsons directly addressed the family members watching. To the descendants of those who were subjected to these unconscionable experiments, particularly the Cooper family, I cannot undo the harm that was done, but I hope that bringing the full truth to light will provide some measure of peace and the medical knowledge necessary to prevent further suffering. Thomas Cooper spent his life trying to make amends for the program we helped create. His nephew Douglas was lost before those efforts could bear fruit, but his great-nieces now have protections that wouldn't have been possible without Thomas's meticulous documentation. As the program concluded, Elizabeth removed Thomas Cooper's personal journal from the bookshelf where she now kept it. She had read it many times in the months since their discovery, finding in its pages not just the horror of what had been done to William Cooper, but the redemptive story of his brother's determination to protect future generations and eventually expose the truth. The final entry, dated just weeks before Thomas's disappearance in 1968, seemed particularly meaningful now. I may not live to see justice done for William and the others. The forces arrayed against exposure are too powerful in this era, and my own complicity makes me vulnerable to their methods. But I have preserved the evidence and established paths for its eventual revelation. Warren will continue this work after me, and perhaps someday William's son or his children will know the full truth. Not just the darkness of what was done, but the light of those who fought to expose it. In this, perhaps there is a measure of redemption, if not for me, then for the Cooper name and legacy. Elizabeth closed the journal reflecting on the complex inheritance that had passed to her daughters, not just the genetic legacy of William Cooper's involuntary participation in those terrible experiments, but the moral legacy of Thomas Cooper's determination to document the truth and protect future generations. From a weathered cabin in the mountains had emerged not just a historical revelation, but a family legacy far more complicated and ultimately more meaningful than she could have imagined when she first opened that certified letter on her kitchen counter. The truth had come at great cost, upending their lives and forcing them into new identities under federal protection. But with that truth had come understanding medical protections for Hannah and Grace and a measure of justice for William and Douglas Cooper. The cabin inheritance that had seemed like another burden in her overwhelming life had ultimately led to an inheritance of truth protection and finally a path forward. On the mantelpiece beside a photograph of Douglas Elizabeth had placed a simple stone from the creek near Warren's cabin, a reminder of where their journey had begun and of the unexpected legacy that had passed to them through the generations. Not just the burden of history's darkest chapters, but the strength to face them honestly and move forward with knowledge rather than ignorance. In the end, perhaps that was the most valuable inheritance of all. 1 year later, Elizabeth Cooper stood on the steps of the Hart Senate office building, watching as the last of the congressional hearings on Project Inheritance concluded. The autumn light cast long shadows across the National Mall as lawmakers, journalists, and family members of identified test subjects dispersed into the Washington afternoon. The hearings had not brought the sweeping justice some had hoped for, but they had accomplished something arguably more important: acknowledgement, medical support, and a path forward. The Cooper family had emerged from federal protection with a negotiated settlement that ensured Hannah and Grace would have lifelong medical monitoring and treatment protocols specifically designed for descendants of Project Inheritance subjects. Elizabeth had used part of the settlement to establish a foundation supporting other affected families, many of whom were still being identified through the meticulous records Thomas Cooper had preserved. Thomas Cooper's documentation had ultimately served its intended purpose not to seek vengeance, but to protect future generations from the shadows of unauthorized experimentation. His brother William and nephew Douglas could not be brought back, but their involuntary sacrifices had not been in vain. The medical protocols developed to address the transgenerational effects were now helping dozens of families who might otherwise have faced the same sudden tragedies without explanation. Warren Cooper's remote cabin had been preserved as part of a historical trust, with the workshop converted into a small private museum, documenting both the darker aspects of Cold War intelligence operations and the courage of those who worked to expose them. The gold recovered from the Nevada cache after extensive legal negotiations had funded both the Cooper Foundation and an academic center dedicated to the ethical oversight of classified research. What struck Elizabeth most profoundly as she watched the proceedings conclude was the complex nature of service and sacrifice that had emerged from the Cooper family story. William had served his country as an Air Force navigator only to be betrayed by the very institutions he had sworn to protect. Thomas had served in intelligence operations, believing in their necessity only to discover the moral compromises hidden within compartmentalized programs. Both men in their different ways had ultimately honored deeper principles than mere organizational loyalty. As Hannah and Grace joined her on the steps, now 14, and showing the resilience that had carried them through their family's extraordinary journey, Elizabeth reflected on the lessons they would carry forward. They understood that patriotism meant loyalty to principles rather than unquestioning obedience to institutions, that oversight and accountability were essential elements of a functioning democracy, and that the courage to expose wrongdoing was as valuable as the courage to serve in the first place. The legacy of the Cooper men, William's unwitting sacrifice, Thomas's methodical documentation, and Douglas's unknowing role as the link between generations had transformed from a burden of secrecy into a foundation for truth and healing. Elizabeth had found in this complex inheritance not just financial security for her daughters, but a profound understanding of citizenship that transcended simple narratives of heroes and villains. As they walked down the steps toward the National Mall, Hannah mentioned that she was considering a career in oversight systems for scientific research inspired not by the darkness her family had encountered, but by the light that had eventually emerged from decades of determined documentation and pursuit of truth. There would always be shadows in the operations of national security, necessary compromises in a complex and dangerous world. But the Cooper story had demonstrated that within those shadows, individual conscience could still create paths toward accountability and redemption. Not perfect justice, such things rarely existed outside of fiction, but progress toward better systems, better oversight, and ultimately better protection for both the nation and its citizens. The cabin in the mountains that had once seemed like just another burden had led them on a journey none could have anticipated. But as they walked together in the shadow of monuments to American ideals, Elizabeth felt certain that Thomas Cooper would have approved of where that journey had ultimately led not to vengeance or easy answers, but to truth acknowledgement and the protection of future generations. In a nation still wrestling with the balance between security and liberty, between necessary secrets and essential oversight, perhaps that was the most valuable inheritance of all.